There's a moment that doesn't come with fanfare, but it changes everything. It doesn't knock loudly or flash a warning. It enters through the side door of your life. During a breakup, a betrayal, a job loss, a humiliating moment you didn't expect. And in that strange, still silence afterward, you stand at a crossroads. Will you resist, or will you ask what this pain is really pointing to? Most people choose the first path. They run, distract themselves, blame the world. Numb it with work, alcohol, scrolling, or a new relationship. Anything to not feel it. Because we've been trained to think pain is a malfunction, a detour, something to escape. But Carl Jung saw something very different. He believed that pain wasn't an enemy to be defeated, but a guide trying to get your attention, a silent messenger from your unconscious. And if you miss that message, life will simply deliver it again, louder. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That line holds a chilling truth, because what we don't understand about ourselves doesn't just disappear, it drives us. From the back seat, quietly steering us into the same arguments, the same heartbreak, the same deep sense that we're stuck or cursed or fated to suffer. Take the case of Leo, a respected architect who had everything on paper: career, family, house by the lake. But he kept sabotaging his peace. He'd pick fights over nothing, walk out during moments of joy. One night, after yelling at his son for spilling juice on blueprints, he sat in the dark, unable to explain why he was trembling. That night, he dreamed of being trapped inside a house with no exits. Every window was bricked shut. He woke up sweating. His therapist asked him, "When did you start believing love was dangerous?" Leo broke down. As a child, his mother would swing between tenderness and violence. He learned early that joy was never safe for long. So as an adult, he destroyed it before it could betray him. The blueprint wasn't the problem, it was the house inside him, the unconscious pattern he hadn't made conscious. That's the trick. Pain rarely screams the truth directly. It whispers it through our behaviors, through our triggers, through the people we can't stand or the patterns we can't break. The mistake we often make is assuming we're just unlucky or flawed or broken. But Jung would say the opposite. He'd say, your pain is trying to show you what you've forgotten, what you've buried, what you've called fate, but is actually just a mirror. And the truth is, we often meet ourselves for the first time in pain, not in our achievements, not in our successes, but in the moment something cracks. That's when the real self begins to rise, not the mask we've perfected for years, but the one we lost as a child and have been quietly searching for ever since. So when it hurts, ask, what if this isn't punishment? What if it's preparation? What if this is the first real conversation you've had with your soul in years? Because Jung didn't promise relief. He promised revelation. And the moment you stop running from what hurts is the moment you start becoming who you were meant to be. Your pain is not punishing you, it's pointing at you. Some breakdowns don't happen with noise, they happen in silence, after the shouting stops. Michael was 37 when his second marriage ended, not with a dramatic fight, but with a quiet closing of a bedroom door. His wife didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She just packed her suitcase and whispered, "I can't keep fighting for space in your fortress." He sat on the couch for hours that night, not crying, because he didn't know how, not angry, because even anger felt like giving up control. What he felt was blank. Like someone had unplugged his life from the wall, and now he was staring at a screen that wouldn't turn back on. What confused him most was this. He did love her. So why had he turned every conversation into a debate? Every apology into a technicality? He once told his therapist, "I'd rather be right than be left." The irony didn't hit him until weeks later. That's when the dreams began. In the first one, he stood in a long hallway. At the end was a locked door. Behind it, he could hear crying. A child's voice, high, panicked, alone. He assumed it was his son from his first marriage. But when he finally forced the door open, he saw something that stole his breath. The boy on the floor was him, 8 years old, shaking, afraid, reaching out. Jung called this the shadow, the part of ourselves we push out of sight. It's not evil, it's not broken, it's just rejected, abandoned. Michael's shadow was vulnerability, softness, need. He grew up in a house where emotion was weakness. His father, a stern, unyielding man, rewarded silence and punished tears. Once, after Michael cried when his dog died, his father slammed his fist on the table and said, "You think the world cares how you feel?" That moment etched a rule into Michael's unconscious. Vulnerability equals danger, so he buried it. But the unconscious doesn't forget. It waits, and it returns, not in polite reminders, but in patterns, arguments, distance-failed intimacy. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The pain in Michael's marriage wasn't random. It was engineered by an old part of him that still wanted to be seen. He began to realize something chilling. Every time his wife asked for connection, it wasn't just her voice he was ignoring. It was the voice behind the door, that child, still reaching out. And in trying so hard to appear strong, he had made himself untouchable. His shadow had become the architect of his loneliness. Not because he was cruel, but because he was unexamined. It wasn't the arguments that ended his marriage. It wasn't the logic. It was the locked door, the unhealed memory that turned intimacy into a battlefield. Dramatic irony whispered through his life like a quiet violin. He was trying to protect himself from pain, and in doing so, created the very pain he feared. The real tragedy. He thought he was being a good man, strong, decisive, unbreakable, but he was breaking anyway, just from the inside out, and all the while, the boy in the dream kept crying. Healing didn't begin when Michael tried to do better. It began when he walked back down the hallway in his dreams, sat beside the crying child, and whispered, "I see you now." Because the truth is, the arguments weren't the problem. The boy behind the door was. Pain returns until the part of you that's hiding is seen. Sometimes, the most dangerous lies aren't the ones we tell others. They're the ones we repeat to ourselves so often, we forget their masks. Have you ever met someone who always plays the victim? Every time something goes wrong, at work, in relationships, in life, they're the ones who are done wrong. But if you look closer, you'll notice a crack in the performance, a flicker in the eyes. Because deep down, even they know it's not the whole story. This isn't just emotional immaturity, it's something far older, far more universal. In Jungian psychology, it's called the persona, the mask we craft to face the world, a socially acceptable version of ourselves that gets approval, avoids judgment, and survives the demands of everyday life. But here's the truth no one tells you. Every mask has a cost. You might protect yourself, but you also bury yourself. James, one of our viewers, experienced this firsthand. His colleagues called him the peacemaker, always calm, always smiling, always agreeable. His boss even wrote on his evaluation, "James is a pleasure, never causes friction." But at home, James would lie in bed at night, clenching his jaw, unable to sleep, his stomach hurt constantly. He snapped at his wife over the smallest things, cold coffee, an unwashed plate. And every time she asked what was wrong, he'd say, "Nothing, I'm just tired." But it wasn't just fatigue. It was repression. His persona, the nice guy, wasn't built on confidence. It was built on fear. Fear of conflict. Fear of being disliked. Fear of his own anger. And Jung warns us, whatever you repress owns you. James's breaking point came in a team meeting. A new intern interrupted him twice. James smiled through it, made a joke, and moved on. But that night he had a vivid dream. He was in a room full of mirrors, and none of the reflections showed his face. Just a blank smile. That image haunted him. He brought it to therapy, and his therapist asked one question: "When did you first decide it was dangerous to show you were upset?" James froze. Then, like floodgates opening, he remembered a moment at age 9 when he got scolded for yelling during a family dinner. His mother had whispered sharply, "People won't like you if you make scenes." And just like that, a rule was written in his unconscious. Being angry equals being unlovable. So he buried his anger, covered it with charm, and wore the mask for nearly 30 years. But masks don't heal wounds. They just cover them. His body knew. That's why the migraine started. That's why the resentment leaked out sideways into sarcasm, cold shoulders, and self-loathing. James wasn't being kind. He was being terrified. And the irony? By avoiding conflict with others, he created a war inside himself. Jung taught that true transformation doesn't come from pretending to be good. It comes from integrating the parts of you that were once banned. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung said, is to become who you truly are. Not a mask, not a label, but a whole, complex, honest self. The persona is necessary. It helps us function. But if you mistake the mask for your face, you forget who you are underneath. You become a stranger to your own emotions, and the longer you wear the mask, the heavier it becomes. Some people collapse under its weight. Others grow bitter, blaming the world for their own false performance. But the brave ones, they stop. They sit with the discomfort. They ask hard questions, and little by little, they remove the mask, not to be exposed, but to finally breathe. Until James faced that inner pressure, it kept leaking out, in migraines, snapping at his wife, and hidden self-hate. Comment if you've ever noticed this in someone you know. There's a reason some people bother you more than others, and it's not always about them. Sometimes, the real irritation is coming from a part of yourself you've locked away. Carl Jung called this projection the unconscious act of assigning your denied qualities, both light and dark, onto others. But projection isn't always dramatic or obvious. It can look like mild dislike, a quiet judgment, a subtle distancing. But beneath that surface reaction lies a deeper question. What part of me am I trying not to see? Take Daniel, a marketing executive in his early 40s. Calm, polished, composed, always level-headed in meetings, always rational in conflict. But he had a problem with his teammate, Marco. "Too dramatic," he said. "Overreacts to everything." Daniel rolled his eyes every time Marco raised his voice in brainstorming sessions or teared up during emotional team reflections. "It's unprofessional," Daniel insisted. But during a one-on-one coaching session, something cracked. Daniel mentioned that as a child, he used to be sensitive, often crying during arguments between his parents. One day, his father snapped and shouted, "Crying doesn't fix anything. Be a man." Daniel hadn't cried since. He taught himself that emotions were dangerous, that showing them invited punishment. He built a persona that was safe, strategic, and emotionally neutral. But that emotional part of him didn't die. It simply went underground. It became shadow. Now, when Marco expressed his feelings openly, Daniel's body remembered something before his mind did, that unsafe space where emotion equaled danger. His irritation wasn't about Marco's behavior. It was about Daniel's exiled boy, the one who learned to hide his heart. Jung once wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." In this case, Daniel's projection had nothing to do with Marco and everything to do with a part of himself crying for recognition. Projection is tricky because it wears such convincing disguises. You think you're judging others clearly, when in reality you're reacting to your own reflection. A father criticizes his son for being lazy, not realizing it's the part of himself that longs to rest. A teacher feels threatened by a confident student, unaware it's her own suppressed ambition speaking. Projection isn't just about discomfort, it's also about longing. Often, the people who make us uncomfortable are carrying pieces of ourselves we've deemed unacceptable. Sometimes it's the anger we never learned to express. Sometimes it's the joy we don't believe we deserve. Sometimes it's the freedom we told ourselves we weren't allowed to have. And the most dangerous part, projection keeps us blind, because as long as we believe the problem is out there, we never look in here. That's how the cycle continues, unseen, unnamed, and uncontested. We lose relationships, we sabotage our peace, we pick fights with the world, all while the real conflict lives inside us. Jung called this the shadow war, the invisible battles we fight within ourselves, projected onto the faces of others. Here's the dramatic irony. The more you deny a part of yourself, the more power it gains. That's why projections don't just fade, they repeat. They intensify, they shape-shift, until you finally stop and ask, what is this really about? That moment of pause is everything, because it's no longer about fixing them, it's about meeting you, and it's only when you reclaim your disowned parts, your tears, your rage, your softness, your mess, that the projection ends. That's when true vision begins. So next time someone gets under your skin, don't just look at them. Look at yourself. Because they might not be the problem, they might be the mirror. Have you seen your own mask slip under pressure? Sometimes the hardest truth to accept is that you're not broken, you are split. You're not failing, you're fragmenting. Most people spend their lives trying to fix what they think is wrong with them, the anger, the anxiety, the shame. But Carl Jung offered a radical idea. You don't heal by becoming perfect, you heal by becoming whole. And that's not the same thing. Healing begins not when you change your behavior, but when you see it clearly, when you understand why you hurt the way you do, and more importantly, who inside you is hurting. This is the path of individuation, Jung's term for the journey of becoming your true self, not the version of you that was sculpted by fear, by family rules, by cultural masks. It's not about becoming better, it's about becoming real. And to do that, you must walk through a strange forest, one filled with contradictions. You'll find you're not just brave, you're also scared. You're not only wise, you're still wounded. You can be a strong leader and still carry the loneliness of the little boy who wasn't hugged enough. Integration means learning to carry all of that at once. I once met a man named Caleb. On the surface, he was solid, smart, successful. He ran a company, donated to causes, and gave great advice to friends. But privately, his relationships kept falling apart. One night after his third breakup in 4 years, he sat alone in his car and just couldn't stop shaking. That's when he knew something deeper was calling. In therapy, a pattern emerged. Every time his partner got too close, he'd pull away. Not in anger, but in cold detachment, like a switch flipped, like he wasn't there anymore. He used to say, "I don't know why I shut down, it just happens." But that's not the full story. What Caleb discovered was that his persona, the mask he wore to the world, was the stable one, the fixer, the unshakable. But behind that was a forgotten child, a child who once sat on the floor while his parents screamed in the kitchen, wishing he could disappear. That boy learned something. Being emotional made you unsafe. So he built walls. He became composed, efficient, unbreakable. But Jung warned, what you resist not only persists, but grows in size. Caleb hadn't solved the pain, he had buried it, and now it was returning through loneliness, through emotional numbness, through an inability to be held. The real twist? Caleb's strength wasn't fake. It just wasn't the whole story. His healing began not when he tried to change, but when he sat with that frightened boy in his memory and said, "You did what you had to do to survive. Thank you, but I've got it from here." He didn't erase the contradiction. He held it. He began journaling, meditating, sometimes even crying in the middle of meetings, not out loud, but internally, letting himself feel instead of just perform. And slowly, his partners stopped leaving, because he stopped disappearing. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But that self isn't simple, it's layered. It's wild and gentle, it's responsible and restless, and the moment you deny one of those parts, it shows up somewhere else, in the people you attract, in the arguments you start, in the roles you overplay. That's the dramatic irony of shadow work. What you think you've locked away is still speaking, just through different mouths. So the next time pain shows up, don't rush to fix it. Sit with it. Ask, what part of me is knocking? What part of me is tired of hiding? Because maybe it's not the end of something. Maybe it's the beginning. Your wound isn't your weakness, it's the doorway to your depth. There's a kind of breakdown that doesn't scream. It whispers. It doesn't happen in a moment of crisis, but in the quiet hallway between one obligation and the next, a collapse that isn't caused by tragedy, but by the slow erosion of your real self. Carl Jung called this a spiritual death, the moment when the gap between your true nature and your performed identity becomes too wide to carry. And for many, it shows up not as a breakdown of the mind, but of the body. Aaron had lived his entire life doing what was expected. He wore discipline like armor. He was the man who never missed a meeting, never showed emotion, never asked for help. He thought this was strength, but when he turned 53, something strange happened. One night, while brushing his teeth, he blacked out. No warning, no illness. At the hospital, doctors ran every test. Nothing. Physically, he was fine, but inside, something had been dying for years. His therapist later said, "It wasn't your body that gave up, it was the part of you that's been buried alive." Aaron had abandoned his inner child, an archetype Jung described as the source of vitality, curiosity, and play. As a boy, Aaron sang, alone, free, and joyfully. He used to sneak into the attic and pretend it was a concert hall. But then his father died, and he was told to man up. Music vanished, and in its place, spreadsheets, rules, perfection. He traded creativity for control, but the soul does not forget its original language. It whispers, then it aches, and if ignored long enough, it will scream, not through words, but through collapse. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, because that means facing the part of you that you silenced to survive." In Aaron's case, exhaustion was not laziness, it was protest. His psyche was tired of pretending. The man who had always been early, responsible, composed, had never really met himself. His therapist asked, "When did you stop letting yourself play?" That question shattered him, because the truth was he didn't remember, but his dreams did. In one recurring dream, Aaron wandered a giant library looking for a single song, but every book he opened was blank. His unconscious was showing him he had filled his life with pages, but erased his own voice. This is the cost of persona, the mask we wear to gain approval, success, or safety. But masks, Jung warned, grow heavy over time, and when your mask becomes your identity, the real you suffocates underneath it. Aaron's collapse was not a failure. It was a cry for reconnection. Reconnection with the boy in the attic, the artist, the playful one, the one who was never weak, just never welcomed. Ironically, we often mistake burnout for failure, but Jung would say, it's the soul refusing to go further down a false path. It's not depression, it's direction, And the invitation isn't to push harder, but to pause, to remember what the world asked you to forget. Who were you before the world told you who to be? Is not a poetic question, it's a survival one. Because the longer you betray your inner nature, the louder the betrayal becomes. Aaron didn't need a new routine. He needed a resurrection. He started singing again, quietly at first, then loudly, not for applause, but for alignment. Because once you taste your true voice, silence feels like death, Jung's work reminds us. The parts we lock away don't disappear, they wait. And often, they wait inside pain, inside collapse, inside the moment you finally stop and listen. The soul doesn't want perfection, it wants permission. Permission to be seen, even in its unfinished form. Because when your outer life begins to reflect your inner truth, something radical happens. Not peace that comes from escaping pain, but peace that comes from finally facing it. From realizing it has a face, a voice, a name. You are not meant to live someone else's idea of a good life. Sometimes, the person who annoys you the most is holding the key to the life you are too afraid to live. Carl Jung warned us long ago. What we push away in others is often what we've buried in ourselves. It's easy to point fingers, to label someone as arrogant, dramatic, selfish, or needy. But what if those traits, those very ones we reject, aren't flaws in others? What if they're mirrors? Every time you feel an intense emotional reaction to someone, especially one that seems irrational or overblown, Jung would tell you to pause. Not to shame yourself, but to ask, what part of me am I seeing in them that I've refused to see in myself? This is the phenomenon of projection, and it's one of the most uncomfortable truths in Jungian psychology. We don't just project the bad, we also project our unlived potential. A man named Reuben once confessed to me that he couldn't stand a co-worker named Cyrus. He walks into the room like he owns it, Reuben said. Everything's about him. It's obnoxious. But as we talked deeper, the story changed. Reuben wasn't really mad at Cyrus's confidence. He was grieving his own lack of it. As a child, Reuben was taught to be quiet, humble, and invisible to stay safe in a chaotic household. Speaking up got you punished. So he became the nice guy. The invisible one, always agreeable, always shrinking. Now, every time Cyrus took up space, a silent part of Reuben screamed, "Why don't I get to do that?" That scream wasn't about Cyrus. It was about Reuben's shadow, his repressed hunger to be bold, expressive, and free. Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And that's because full acceptance means acknowledging even the parts of you you've spent decades locking away. Reuben didn't just reject his anger. He rejected his radiance, his leadership, his joy, the very things that once made him feel alive and unsafe. Projection isn't always about darkness. Sometimes it's about brilliance we've been taught to fear. A young teacher told me he resented a student who was too passionate. He called him too much. But later, he admitted he once loved theater, until his father mocked him for being soft. That boy's passion wasn't annoying. It was a ghost, a memory of a version of himself he wasn't allowed to keep. Here's the tragic irony. The more disconnected we are from ourselves, the more we react to others, because the world keeps putting our missing pieces in front of us, until we're ready to stop running and start reclaiming them. So, next time you feel that irrational irritation, don't just dismiss it. Study it. Because that person who triggers you might not be your enemy. They might be carrying something you forgot belonged to you. A dream, a gift, a freedom. That's the mystery of individuation, the slow uncovering of the self you left behind. And sometimes, your unlived life walks into the room wearing someone else's face. What if the people who trigger you most are carrying your unlived life? Every judgment is a flashlight, pointing inward. The night sea journey, Carl Jung's haunting term for what every soul must one day face. There comes a point where you stop being able to distract yourself. Not because you don't try, but because the distractions stop working. The gym doesn't help. The social posts feel empty. Even success begins to taste like ash. That's when it begins, the quiet descent. The part you didn't plan for. Carl Jung called it the night sea journey, a plunge into the unconscious, into the parts of ourselves that have been buried, banished, or denied, not a breakdown. A breakthrough, disguised as darkness. It's the moment when life doesn't fall apart. It strips away your illusions. The masks you wore, the rules you obeyed, the person you performed as. Suddenly, you're adrift with no map. But that's not a mistake. It's the invitation. One man named Elias, a high-performing marketing executive in his 40s, once told me that the scariest part of burnout wasn't the exhaustion. It was realizing he didn't know who he was without the hustle. He had always been the fixer, the reliable one, the one who never said no. But when his hands started shaking in meetings, when his voice cracked giving presentations, when he found himself weeping alone in his car for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't know who to be. His shadow had risen. Years of repressed fear, doubt, grief. It didn't care about KPIs or praise. It wanted attention. And the more he resisted it, the more chaotic his world became. His dreams turned vivid. He'd see tidal waves swallowing cities, glass offices turning into caves. His unconscious wasn't breaking him. It was breaking through. In mythology, the hero never grows in the palace. He grows in the wilderness, in the cave, in exile. And the modern world? It tricks us. It tells us if you're hurting, you're failing, that being lost is weak, that silence is lazy. So we scroll, we perform positivity, we push through, but the psyche doesn't care about our performance. It still speaks in ancient language, symbols, metaphors, emotional echoes. It will not be ignored. If we don't listen through reflection, it will speak through heartbreak, if not through insight, then through illness. Jung said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." And that awakening is rarely pleasant. It's often lonely, slow, even terrifying, but it's real. Elias eventually realized his breakdown wasn't a flaw, it was a message. He wasn't just tired, he was unexpressed. All his life, he had hidden the poet inside him. As a child, he used to write songs, but his father, a hardened entrepreneur, mocked them. Music is for dreamers, be a man. So Elias learned to bury the boy who sang in silence. But that boy never died. He waited. And now, with Elias's life cracking at the seams, that voice began to rise. And when Elias finally picked up his old guitar, something ancient returned, not to save his career, but to save his soul. The truth? Your suffering isn't a glitch. It's an encrypted letter from your deeper self. When something hurts too much to explain, it might be trying to bypass your logic. Speak in metaphor. Ask you to pause. Ask you to feel. The night sea journey is not about drowning. It's about finding what floats when everything else sinks. And so, if your life feels like it's unraveling, maybe it's not the end. Maybe it's the descent before the return. Because as Jung once said, in all chaos there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. Pain is the proof that something inside you still wants to live. There's a quiet witness inside you. It doesn't speak in words, but you feel it watching when you lie, when you pretend, when you laugh at a joke you don't find funny or nod in agreement just to keep the peace. That part of you, your truest self, is always there. Not loud, not boastful, just present, and the more you ignore it, the heavier life feels. Carl Jung believed this inner self wasn't just a philosophical idea, it was the key to everything. You are what you do, not what you say you'll do, he wrote. But in reality, many of us become strangers to our own actions. We wear masks so well we forget they were ever costumes. We polish our resumes, filter our photos, say the right things, and all the while, the person we were meant to become waits quietly behind the curtain, wondering if we'll ever turn around. Take Ethan, a respected educator and father of two. On paper, he was a role model. Always calm, always composed. His students adored him, but his home life was a different story. He avoided conflict with his wife, silenced his own needs, and retreated into work whenever emotional intimacy was required. When his marriage began to crack, he couldn't understand why. "I did everything right," he told his therapist. But one night, after a mild argument, his daughter said something that split him in half. "Dad, do you even know what you feel?" The words haunted him. That question wasn't just from his child, it was from himself. Jung believed we live divided lives, the person we show to the world, the persona, and the one that watches us when no one's looking. And the more those two selves drift apart, the more we suffer. Not just in dramatic breakdowns, but in quiet, chronic ways. Numbness, bitterness, unexplained anxiety, and restlessness that feels like something's missing, but we don't know what. That's the soul trying to speak. Ethan began to dream of a hallway filled with mirrors, but every mirror reflected someone else, his boss, his father, his own students. Never him. That dream wasn't random. Jung believed dreams were letters from the unconscious. Each mirror was a persona, an identity Ethan had worn to win approval, but none of them showed his actual reflection. Because he hadn't seen it in years. Why does this happen? Why do we abandon ourselves? For most, it begins in childhood. You learn early what parts of you are safe to show. Maybe you were praised for being quiet, so you silenced your curiosity. Maybe you were rewarded for being tough, so you buried your tears. You don't become fake overnight, you become safe. And then you forget who you were before you needed armor. But that self never disappears, it waits. And the more life asks you to make decisions, relationships, careers, families, the more your shadow starts to knock. Because it's not enough to be liked or admired, or even successful. If those things cost you your own authenticity, they begin to rot from the inside. There's a dramatic irony in how the world works. You can fool everyone. You can win every award, get every like, command every room, and still feel hollow, because you'll know the version they love. "Isn't you true maturity?" Jung said. "Begins when the mask starts to fall, and instead of panicking, you pause. You ask, what part of me is afraid to be seen right now?" For Ethan, it was the part that grew up in a house where emotions were mocked. Vulnerability wasn't just discouraged, it was punished. So he built his identity on control, on order, on never needing anything. But underneath that composure was a terrified boy who thought love had to be earned through performance. And here's the turning point. Once Ethan realized the mask wasn't strength, it was fear. He didn't rip it off. He got curious. He met that inner child. Not with shame, but with compassion. He apologized to the part of him he had abandoned. And slowly, something shifted. He stopped trying to be the perfect father. He started being a present one. He stopped avoiding conflict. He started telling the truth, even when it trembled. This is the path of individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming whole, not flawless, not polished, but whole. Jung wasn't interested in helping people appear functional. He wanted them to be authentic. That means letting the part of you that's been watching finally speak, letting the inner witness become the inner guide. There's a line Jung never said directly, but it lingers through all his work like an echo. Your true character isn't what you show, it's what you're willing to face. We don't sabotage ourselves because we're broken. We do it because we're loyal. Loyal to old beliefs, loyal to emotional contracts we made when we were too young to understand them, and that loyalty runs deeper than logic. You say you want love, success, peace, but then you pull away the second it arrives. Not because you're weak, but because your unconscious doesn't trust it. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Why terrifying? Because to accept yourself, you have to confront the reasons you learned not to. That's not just self-help, that's psychological excavation. You're not just changing your habits, you're unraveling the secret agreements you made with pain to survive. Let me tell you about Daryl. He's 41. On paper, he's a great catch, successful, thoughtful, generous. And yet, every relationship he starts seems to crash at the same point, right when real intimacy begins. The women he chooses, brilliant, beautiful, and always emotionally unavailable. They travel a lot, they don't open up. They're still figuring things out. And every time it ends, Daryl says the same thing. I just want someone who's present. But when we sat down and dug deeper, something strange came up. Daryl had a vivid memory. He was 9, standing at the window, watching his mom drive away after another fight with his father. She didn't come back for 2 weeks. That was the first time he told himself, don't need anyone too much. It hurts. That belief burrowed deep, becoming part of his shadow. So now, whenever someone tries to get close, he flinches. Not outwardly, but inwardly, he goes cold, pushes, sabotages, chooses someone who won't stay. His unconscious is protecting that little boy. This is the paradox. The more you crave something your unconscious fears, the more you'll unconsciously destroy it. Jung called this the tyranny of the shadow. The unloved parts of you run the show from the basement, and they're very good at hiding the remote. Another example, a woman named Marla told me she always wanted to be a public speaker. She took the courses, built the brand, but every time she got a real opportunity, she got sick, lost her voice. Maybe I'm just not cut out for this, she said. But the truth, when she was a teenager, she gave a speech at school, and her father mocked her in front of the family. Her unconscious made a rule that day. Visibility equals humiliation. So now, every time she steps near her dream, her body shuts her down. That's not failure, that's protection. Comfort isn't always truth. Sometimes it's trauma wearing cozy clothes. We fall for the familiar, even if it hurts, because familiar means predictable. Predictable means safe, or at least it used to. But now, you're older, and the wound you're protecting is no longer the threat it once was, but it still thinks it is. That's why Jung emphasized the power of making the unconscious conscious, because only then do we stop mistaking old fears for present reality. The hardest part is, you won't see it clearly at first. You'll just notice patterns. The same endings, the same fights, the same disappointments. You'll call it bad luck or just how I am. But beneath it all is a part of you still holding on to a story you didn't write, but one you're still living. A story that says, this is as much love as you're allowed. This is as much success as you deserve. But the moment you see that story, it begins to lose power. You don't need to erase your past. You just need to ask why it's still driving. Then take the keys back. Because here's the truth most people never hear. You're not failing. You're protecting a wound that still thinks it needs hiding. There's a deeper kind of pain than sadness. It's the ache of fragmentation. The sense that your life is made up of pieces that don't quite fit together. You smile when you feel like crying. You lead when all you want is to rest. You're praised for being responsible, but no one sees how hollow it feels. Jung believed this fracture wasn't random, it was inherited, taught, cultivated, because in order to be accepted, most of us had to abandon parts of ourselves. But those parts don't vanish. They go underground. They become your shadow. And here's the hard truth. Healing isn't about getting rid of those parts. It's about inviting them back in. Jung didn't say, become perfect. He said, become whole. And wholeness is messy. It means making space for contradictions. For the parts of you that don't get applause, the anger you were taught to suppress, the joy you were told was too much, the tenderness that got mocked. These aren't flaws, they're orphaned aspects of the self. Jung called this the process of individuation, the journey of becoming your full, authentic self by integrating your unconscious material, your shadow, your dreams, your wounds, your unlived life. Let me tell you a story. Gavin was 46, a startup founder known for his discipline. He was sharp, stoic, always composed in meetings. Investors loved him. Employees feared him. At home, he was quiet, sometimes cold. His teenage son once asked, "Do you even feel anything?" That night, Gavin had a dream. He was at a funeral, watching himself being buried in a suit he never liked. No one cried. No one spoke. When he woke up, his chest hurt. He went to therapy reluctantly. Over weeks, they unearthed a truth. As a child, Gavin had been scolded for being too sensitive. He loved drawing. He cried at movies. But one day, his father called him a soft boy in front of the neighbors. Gavin didn't cry again for 30 years. So what happened to that boy? He didn't disappear. He built a company. He got awards. But he also showed up as coldness in marriage, distance with friends, a body that carried tension like armor. "Why do I feel like I'm living someone else's life?" he once asked. The answer wasn't in pushing harder. It was in remembering, in reclaiming the pieces he had locked away. This is why self-improvement can sometimes be a trap. It focuses on performance, on optimizing, upgrading, removing flaws. But Jung's path was different. It wasn't about becoming a better version of yourself. It was about becoming all of yourself. That means facing the wild parts, the scared parts, the angry parts, the loving parts. It means asking deeper questions. Not, how do I fix this? But why did this part of me go into hiding? One man I worked with, a firefighter named Darren, had crippling anxiety. He saw it as weakness, tried to crush it. But one day, in session, he paused. "What if it's trying to help me?" he asked. That question changed everything. He realized his anxiety always spiked when he had to ask for help, because as a child, needing others had led to punishment. So his anxiety was like an old soldier, wounded, loyal, and scared. Not the enemy. The guardian. Darren didn't need to destroy it. He needed to lead it. This is what integration means. Sitting with your symptoms, listening to the ache instead of fighting it. Letting your broken pieces tell their story. Because beneath every panic attack is a part of you that once wasn't safe. Beneath every outburst is a voice that was never heard. And beneath every mask is a face longing to be seen. Jung said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." But that becoming requires presence. It requires walking through the forest of your contradictions, not cutting them down, because some of your deepest wisdom is hiding in your most rejected traits. So next time you feel resistance, pause. Ask, what are you protecting me from? That's not weakness. That's leadership. Because wholeness doesn't begin when you fix your life. It begins when you listen to it. Integration begins when you stop trying to cut off what hurts and start listening instead. There's a strange kind of truth that only whispers when the world is asleep. You won't hear it in meetings or traffic or in the middle of an argument. But close your eyes, fall into the dark, and there it is, speaking in symbols, shadows, and impossible stories. Dreams are not nonsense. They are not leftover brain static. They are coded messages from the unconscious. And Carl Jung treated them like sacred texts. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes, he said. But he also believed that our dreams are the bridge between those two worlds, the outer role we play and the inner truth we hide. A man named Victor came to therapy after a nervous breakdown at work. He was a CFO, logical, polished, and in control. But at night, he kept dreaming of a boy lost in a burning library. The fire never reached the boy, but every book around him turned to ash, one by one. When Victor described the dream, he brushed it off. Stress, probably. But the dream returned, again and again, each time more vivid. When we explored it, what emerged was something he hadn't said aloud in 30 years. Victor used to write poetry, not just write, breathe it. But in college, after being mocked by a professor in front of a room full of finance majors, he threw his notebook in a dumpster, never wrote again. The boy in the dream was the poet, the library, his inner world of meaning. And the fire, the slow, quiet destruction of a self he had exiled. Jung believed that dreams reveal the forgotten, the disowned, the sacred fragments of the self that have gone underground. They speak in metaphor because the ego, our waking mind, can't handle direct confrontation, so the psyche disguises the truth, but it never abandons it. Until you make the unconscious conscious, Jung warned, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Victor's life looked successful, but inside, he was burning, and his dreams were sounding the alarm. Dreams also reveal patterns before they show up in real life. That's why Jung treated them like oracles. Not to predict the future, but to expose the emotional truth already growing inside us. A woman might dream she's drowning in a pool while people cheer nearby. She wakes up and thinks, weird. But 2 weeks later, she realizes that's how she feels in her marriage, drowning in unmet needs while pretending to be fine. The dream knew. The soul always knows. And what about nightmares? They're not punishments, they're protests. Jung saw nightmares as psychic revolts, the unconscious demanding to be heard, like a child throwing a tantrum after being ignored too long. One man I spoke to kept dreaming that his teeth were falling out. He feared it meant aging, but it wasn't about time, it was about truth. He was always biting his tongue, avoiding conflict, smiling through disrespect. His dream was screaming, "You're losing your bite." The unconscious doesn't waste symbols. If you dream of houses, you're dreaming of yourself. Rooms you never enter are rooms you avoid in life, emotions or memories you've locked away. If you're climbing a staircase endlessly, it may reflect your perfectionism, your refusal to rest. If someone's chasing you but never catches you, ask yourself, what emotion are you running from? One patient told me of a dream where he was in a house with no doors. Every hallway led to another hallway, every room to another room. It felt endless. He kept searching for a way out, but never found one. When we sat with it, the realization hit. The house was his mind, always thinking, analyzing, planning, but never feeling, never resting. He prided himself on being rational, always in control. But he'd built a mansion of logic and forgotten how to feel his way out. Jung believed the dream world was not fake, it was deeper than real. Because dreams aren't bound by logic, they're bound by meaning. They reflect our soul's weather. They tell us when we've gone too far from our true selves. And when we listen, really listen, we begin to see the parts of us that never stopped hoping to be known. So before you brush off your next strange dream, ask, what is this image trying to show me? What have I ignored so long that it needed to come to me at night? Because even when your ego sleeps, your soul stays awake and it speaks. Dreams are the whispers of the soul when the ego is asleep. What if the very thing you've spent your whole life running from was actually your doorway forward? Most people don't realize this until everything falls apart. A job lost, a relationship crumbled, a sudden illness. And in that moment, the world doesn't just take something, it gives you something terrifying and holy. A mirror, Carl Jung believed we are not meant to be fixed. We are meant to be revealed. The privilege of a lifetime, he once said, is to become who you truly are. But how do you even begin that journey when all you've known is pretending, performing, avoiding what hurts? The answer is simple. But it is not easy. You begin. Not by making a list, not by setting goals. You begin by stopping, by sitting with the ache you usually run from. You begin by asking your anxiety why it's screaming, by noticing how you flinch when someone compliments you, by asking, not judging. This is not about self-help. This is about self-discovery. Jung called it the process of individuation, becoming whole by confronting the hidden, the exiled, the forgotten parts of yourself. Not to erase them, but to integrate them, the shy child, the angry teen, the controlling adult. All have something to teach you, but only if you stop running. Consider Matteo, a respected attorney with a reputation for calm under pressure. On the outside, he was unshakable, but inside, he was fraying. His son once dropped a glass at dinner and Matteo erupted, red-faced, shaking. Everyone froze, including him. That outburst wasn't about the glass. It was about the years he spent as a child cleaning up his alcoholic father's messes, being blamed for chaos he didn't cause. In therapy, Matteo wept for the boy who had no permission to break, the boy who decided emotions were dangerous. So he became perfect, controlled, successful, but also cold. And then his body began to rebel. Panic attacks, migraines, sleepless nights. His soul was no longer willing to be managed like a courtroom. It wanted truth. Not performance, not productivity, but presence. And so, Matteo began, not with confidence, but with humility. He started noticing the moments his chest tightened. He began journaling about his father. He let his son see him cry. Slowly, his identity cracked open, not as weakness, but as access. Because Jung was clear, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That's the power of this work. It doesn't promise comfort, it promises clarity. The path of self-awareness is not about fixing what's broken, it's about remembering what's been buried. The dreams, the fears, the child who used to dance in the kitchen before shame told him not to. And yes, it's painful. But so is staying asleep in a life that doesn't feel like yours. So you begin. You stop running from what hurts. You slow down enough to ask what it's here to teach you. You stop fighting the part of you that's scared, and you learn its language. That's the gift of Jung's work. It doesn't give you a perfect path. It gives you a mirror. You won't always like what you see. But the more you look, the more you recognize yourself. Not the role you play, not the wounds you carry, but the person underneath. That's self-awareness. That's the journey of individuation. And once you start walking it, you realize something incredible. The pain didn't come to break you. It came to reveal you. The moment you stop fighting what hurts is the moment you start becoming who you were meant to be.